5 true scary stories from haunted restaurants that will terrify you. Restaurant horror tales. The restaurant stood alone at the edge of a bustling city, its modern facade starkly contrasting with the decaying buildings surrounding it. A sleek, black sign hung above the entrance, casting a shadow on the cracked sidewalk. The name was simple yet haunting: The Mirage. It beckoned with an allure of mystery, a place where the mundane and the supernatural blurred into a single, unsettling experience. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a kind of eerie silence that pressed against your chest. Dim, ambient lighting barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The walls, adorned with abstract murals, appeared to be moving, figures shifting in and out of view the longer one stared. The tables, though modern and polished, were arranged with an almost deliberate disarray, as if the very layout of the room was designed to unsettle. The air smelled faintly of incense, but it wasn't the pleasant kind. There was something off about it, as if it had been there too long, lingering in the corners of the room like an old, forgotten secret. No one was laughing, no clinking glasses or cheerful chatter. It was as though the restaurant itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. 5 strangers sat around a large, round table, each of them different in age and appearance, yet they were united by an unspoken connection. They had all, in one way or another, been drawn to this place. They could have been anyone, tourists, locals, passersby. But here, they were strangers bound by a dark thread. The hostess, an elderly woman with weathered skin and piercing eyes, stood at the edge of their table, silently observing them for what felt like an eternity. Her gaze was uncomfortably direct, as if she were seeing through them, peering into the depths of their souls. She wore a black dress that seemed too heavy for the occasion, its long sleeves trailing down to the floor like forgotten memories. "Welcome to the Mirage," she said, her voice soft but carrying a weight to it, as if each word were a secret waiting to be uncovered. "You've all come for a reason, and it's no accident that you've found your way here. But first, I have a request." She leaned forward, her eyes glinting with something that could only be described as knowing. "Why don't you share your stories?" A hush fell over the group. For a moment, none of them spoke. They exchanged glances, a mixture of curiosity and hesitation in their eyes. Was this part of the experience? Was it the menu? Or perhaps the dark ambience had already begun to weave its influence over them, stirring up fears they didn't know they had. The old woman smiled, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She waved a hand toward the table. "Tell us your stories of places just like this, of dining experiences that left you shaken, unnerved, or worse." She sat down slowly, her posture unnaturally stiff, as if she had been sitting in this exact position for years. The strangers looked at each other once more, and then, one by one, they began to speak. They hadn't come for this strange invitation. But something in the air, the atmosphere of this restaurant, compelled them to share. Perhaps it was the loneliness of their individual lives. Perhaps it was the promise of something beyond the ordinary. Or perhaps it was the flicker of curiosity that had sparked in each of them the moment they walked through the door. As the group began to share their terrifying restaurant stories, the atmosphere in the Mirage seemed to shift. The dim lights flickered, the murals on the walls seemed to pulse with life, and the very air grew heavy with the weight of each tale. The camera, ever so slowly, zoomed in on their faces, capturing the expressions that flickered between fear and disbelief. The words were coming now, spilling out in hushed tones, as if they feared speaking too loudly would awaken something dark and ancient. These stories were more than just ghost tales. They were warnings, each one connected by a strange thread, linked by a force that transcended time and space. As the strangers began to reveal their experiences, one could almost feel the walls of the restaurant pressing in, as if it were alive, absorbing every detail, every confession. It was as though the Mirage itself had been waiting for this moment. And so the stories began. Stories of diners who disappeared, of curses hidden in secret dishes, of haunted walls that bore witness to dark, terrible deeds. The group would soon learn that these stories weren't just for entertainment. They were the key to something much larger, a deeper mystery that no one could escape. Each of them would soon realize that their fates had already been sealed the moment they walked through the door. And what they would learn was that sometimes the things that haunt us aren't ghosts or spirits. They are the shadows we carry within ourselves, waiting to be revealed. Story 1. The Haunted Diner, where history meets horror. It was a chilly autumn evening when Marcus and Emily decided to venture out to the old diner located on the outskirts of town. Neither of them had been to the place before, but the local rumors had piqued their curiosity. Known for its vintage charm and an atmosphere that seemed suspended in time, the diner stood at the edge of a forest, where fog often rolled in like a blanket, hiding the building from view until you were right upon it. The exterior of the diner was like a snapshot from a bygone era. The faded neon sign, barely visible in the gloom, flickered intermittently, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. The small, rectangular windows were smudged, as though no one had bothered to clean them in years. Inside, the diner was stuck in the 1950s with its red leather booths, checkered floors, and chrome fixtures. It was a place that seemed out of time, as though it had been forgotten by history but never quite erased from existence. The couple settled into a booth by the window. Marcus, ever the skeptic, had heard the stories but dismissed them as overblown. Emily, on the other hand, had always been fascinated by history, especially the history of places like this, steeped in mystery and time-worn charm. She loved the idea of uncovering the stories hidden within these walls, the lives of those who had come before them. She couldn't resist asking the waitress about the diner's history. The waitress, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, leaned in close as she poured their coffee, lowering her voice to a whisper. "It's not just the diner that's old, you know. The original owners vanished mysteriously years ago. No one really knows what happened to them. Some say they ran off with money. Others say they were taken by something not of this world." Marcus chuckled, but Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. "What do you mean by taken?" she asked, intrigued. The waitress's face darkened, and she gave a quick glance toward the kitchen. "I don't like to talk about it, but some say the spirits of the original owners still haunt this place. You'll feel them watching you sometimes. They say the diner's cursed." As they sat eating their meal, the air in the diner grew heavier. The flickering of the lights became more pronounced. The hum of the jukebox seemed to slow down, and the temperature dropped despite the warmth of the food. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the diner itself was alive, holding its secrets close. That night, after the meal, they decided to stay a little longer, letting the strange atmosphere seep into their bones. Marcus, already growing uneasy, suggested they leave. But Emily, with her curiosity piqued, decided to investigate further. She wandered toward the back of the diner, where the kitchen and storage rooms were located. The doors creaked as she pushed them open, revealing a space shrouded in darkness, save for the weak light spilling through the cracks. There, among boxes of forgotten supplies and dusty shelves, Emily found an old, yellowed newspaper clipping wedged between two crates. The headline read, "Local diner owners mysteriously vanish without a trace." The article was sparse, detailing the disappearance of the original owners, a young couple who had opened the diner in the 1940s. The police had found no clues, no signs of a struggle, just an empty diner and the lingering smell of something burning. As she read on, Emily felt an odd tug in the pit of her stomach. The more she learned about the owners, the more it seemed their disappearance was not just a mystery, it was a tragedy. The diner had been their dream, their life's work, and it was as if their spirits were still bound to the place, never allowed to leave. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps behind her jolted her from her thoughts. She turned to find Marcus standing in the doorway, his face pale and tense. "We need to leave," he said, his voice tight. "Something's wrong here." Before Emily could respond, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she heard a whisper, soft and urgent, as though it were coming from all around her. "Get out, leave now." In an instant, the walls of the diner seemed to close in on her. The floor beneath her feet shifted, as if the very ground were alive, pulling her down. The newspaper slipped from her hands as a cold, invisible force yanked her backward. Marcus reached out to grab her, but it was as if the air itself was resisting him, pushing him away. Then everything went black. Emily found herself standing in a different time. The diner was brighter, newer, but the atmosphere was the same, oppressive, thick with the weight of something unfinished. She could see the original owners behind the counter, smiling, but there was an underlying tension in their eyes. As she looked around, she realized she was no longer in her body. She was a spectator in a past that had been erased, forced to relive the tragic moments leading up to their disappearance. The couple, their names she now knew were Clara and George, had been unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows of their diner. They had welcomed all customers, but some had come with dark intentions. That night, a storm had rolled in, trapping the owners and a few unlucky patrons inside. As the clock struck midnight, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered wildly, the air grew thick with a strange energy, and the temperature plummeted. And then, without warning, the diner had erupted into chaos. Clara and George had tried to escape, but the diner itself seemed to be fighting against them, trapping them inside. In their final moments, they had looked into the eyes of the patrons who had turned on them, their faces twisted in unnatural fear. As they died, the diner seemed to absorb their essence, their spirits bound to the place, unable to leave. Suddenly, Emily was yanked back into the present, gasping for air. The diner was the same as it had been before, but the lingering sense of death and sorrow remained, as though the spirits of Clara and George had never truly left. Marcus, now visibly shaken, helped Emily to her feet. "Did you see it too?" he asked, his voice trembling. She nodded, but could find no words to describe what she had just experienced. They left the diner in silence, the door creaking shut behind them, but the feeling of the spirits, Clara and George, stayed with them. Had they truly witnessed the haunting? Or had the eerie history of the diner simply played tricks on their minds, unhinging their perception of reality? As they drove away, the diner receded into the fog behind them, its lights flickering one last time. But in the back of their minds, they both knew some mysteries, some stories could never be fully explained. Some places, some spirits would always linger watching, waiting, and the mirage would continue to stand, timeless and haunting, forever trapped in the past. Story 2. The Curse of the Forbidden Dish. The grand restaurant Le Nocturne stood proudly in the heart of the city's most affluent district, a place where the wealthy came to indulge in culinary art that was as much about spectacle as taste. Its reputation was built on more than just exquisite dishes. It was known for pushing the boundaries of gastronomy, for creating experiences that were memorable and often haunting. The chef, Armand Leclerc, was a genius, but rumors about his eccentricities were as much a part of the allure as the food itself. Some said he could make a dish so perfect that it would change your life forever. Others whispered that there were ingredients in his kitchen that could alter reality. When a renowned food critic, Celeste Turner, was invited to Le Nocturne for an exclusive tasting, she knew it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Celeste had built her career on brutal honesty, tearing apart the pretensions of high-end dining establishments with her scathing reviews. Her words could make or break a restaurant. She prided herself on her discerning palate, her ability to see through the smoke and mirrors of the culinary world. For her, Le Nocturne was just another restaurant, no better or worse than any of the others she had visited in her years of critic work. Upon arrival, she was led to a private dining room, the atmosphere thick with elegance. The lights were dim, casting soft shadows on the polished wood tables, and the air was rich with the smell of exotic spices and fresh ingredients. Armand himself greeted her, his eyes sharp but welcoming, as if he already knew she would be the one to experience his latest creation. "I have something special for you tonight," Armand said, his voice low and measured. "A dish that is not on the menu, one that will change your perspective on cuisine forever." Celeste raised an eyebrow, intrigued but skeptical. "I've heard that before. A lot of chefs like to claim their dishes are life-changing." Armand smiled faintly, his lips curling into a mysterious grin. This isn't a claim, it's a promise. He gestured toward the table, and a sleek, black plate was set before her. The dish was a work of art, an intricate arrangement of colors and textures, each element delicately placed as if it were a masterpiece. Celeste's stomach growled, but she remained guarded. The critic's job was to remain objective, to dissect every dish with a cold, analytical eye. She lifted her fork, spearing a portion of the mysterious dish, and brought it to her lips. The first bite was unlike anything she had ever tasted, intense and yet subtle, a flavor that danced on her tongue like an orchestra of spices. It was otherworldly. For a moment, she forgot she was a food critic and was simply a person enjoying the experience. But as the taste lingered, a strange feeling washed over her. She felt lightheaded, as if the world around her was starting to shift. Her vision blurred. At first, it was just a small distortion, flickers at the edge of her sight, but then it became undeniable. The walls of the restaurant seemed to ripple like a mirage, and Celeste's surroundings began to darken. The soft music playing in the background twisted into a faint, dissonant melody, and the faces of the diners at the other tables warped into grotesque, mocking versions of themselves. A voice, quiet but insistent, whispered in her ear, "You've made them suffer." Celeste spun in her chair, her breath quickening. The room was no longer the refined restaurant she had entered. The walls seemed to pulse with an ominous energy, and in the corners of her vision, shadows moved. Figures from her past, people she had crossed during her career. She saw Mark, the young chef whose restaurant she had destroyed with a harsh review, standing in the corner, his face twisted in anguish. "You took everything from me," he spat, his voice echoing in the air. Next, a well-known sommelier appeared, his face bruised, his expression filled with betrayal. "I trusted you," he said, his eyes hollow, as if drained of all hope. Celeste's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. What was happening to her? This wasn't possible. These people, these faces, they couldn't be here. But with every bite of the dish, the hallucinations grew stronger, more real. Her breath grew shallow, her body trembling. But the worst was yet to come. As she tried to stand, to escape, the shadows seemed to close in around her, blocking the exit. She could feel the heat of their anger, the weight of their judgment pressing in on her. The walls, once elegant, were now covered in blood-red graffiti, taunting her for her cruelty. "You ruined their lives," was scrawled in jagged letters across the floor, the message echoing in her mind. Desperate, she called out to Armand, but he was nowhere to be seen. The dining room was now a labyrinth of twisted mirrors and broken tables, each one reflecting a different version of herself. One that was younger, more innocent, but also one that was cold and unfeeling. She was no longer sure which was real, which was the true Celeste. And then the vision shifted again. She was no longer in the restaurant. She was standing in the middle of a vast, barren desert, the sun blazing overhead, scorching her skin. She felt the ground beneath her crack open, a dark chasm emerging from the earth. Figures, distorted and angry, emerged from the cracks. The souls of the critics she had destroyed, the people she had torn apart with her words. One by one, they reached out to her, their hands grasping her wrists, pulling her closer to the abyss. She could hear their voices, their pain, their suffering. "This is your punishment," they whispered. "For every soul you've ruined, for every career you've destroyed." In that moment, Celeste understood. The dish wasn't just a culinary creation, it was a curse. A vengeful recipe passed down through generations, designed to force those who tasted it to confront the consequences of their actions. Every critic who ate the forbidden dish would be forced to face the wrath of those they had wronged, a torment that would never end. With every ounce of strength, Celeste tried to break free, to escape the horrors that gripped her. But the more she struggled, the more the visions intensified, the more she felt herself slipping away into madness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The desert, the figures, the torment vanished. Celeste was back in the restaurant, staring at the now empty plate before her. She was drenched in sweat, her heart still pounding in her chest, but there was no sign of Armand. No sign of the other diners. Was it all a hallucination? Or had it been real? Had the curse of the forbidden dish taken hold of her? She didn't know. All she knew was that she could never eat again without feeling the weight of those she had destroyed. Critics, the chefs, the innocent lives. Her ambition had come at a terrible cost. And as she stumbled out of Le Nocturne, the door closed behind her with a soft thud, as if the restaurant itself were locking her in with the curse, forever bound to the consequences of her actions. The next morning, the story of Celeste's sudden disappearance would make headlines across the city, but no one would ever know the true cause. And as for the dish, it would continue to be served to those who dared to ask for it, its legacy of vengeance waiting for the next ambitious soul to fall prey to its power. Story 3. Vanishing Customers, a restaurant mystery. The city of St. Mark's was known for its vibrant nightlife, where neon signs lit the streets and the hum of excitement never seemed to fade. Restaurants, bars, and nightclubs spilled out onto the sidewalk, creating an energy that pulsed through the veins of the city's downtown district. Among the most popular spots was Le Coeur de Minuit, a high-end restaurant famous for its sophisticated ambience and exquisite menu. The restaurant had been a staple of St. Mark's for years, attracting both locals and tourists alike. Its glossy reputation was built on its impeccable service, exclusive clientele, and mouth-watering dishes. But recently, something strange had begun to happen. Customers who walked into Le Coeur de Minuit never walked out. At first, it was a single missing person, then another, and another. The disappearances were always the same. A couple of well-dressed patrons would arrive for dinner, order a meal, and then vanish without a trace. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It became a pattern, a chilling trend that left the city's residents whispering in fear. The police were quick to dismiss the disappearances as coincidence. After all, people go missing all the time in a city as busy as St. Mark's. But the victims were never found, and there was something unsettling about the way each of them vanished. No signs of struggle, no clues left behind, nothing. It was as if they had simply evaporated into thin air. The cases were quickly forgotten, buried under layers of bureaucracy and indifference. Except for one person, Hannah Clark. Hannah was a tenacious journalist, always on the lookout for a story that could unearth the truth. She had been following the disappearances from the start, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a pattern to it all, a hidden thread running through each case that the authorities had missed. The victims had all been regulars, locals who frequented Le Coeur de Minuit, yet no one seemed to notice the connection between their disappearances. The more she dug, the deeper the mystery became. One night, after a long day of investigating, Hannah decided to pay a visit to the restaurant herself. She didn't plan to eat. She wasn't sure if she'd even be able to stomach the food after all the stories she'd heard. But she needed to be close to the source. She needed to observe to see if there was anything unusual she could uncover. As she walked into the dimly lit dining room, the rich scent of roasted meats and spices filled the air. The soft murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses were all familiar sounds, the comforting backdrop to an otherwise unsettling evening. Hannah found a seat at the bar, ordering a glass of wine. She kept her eyes open, scanning the room for anything out of the ordinary. The staff moved with a practiced grace, their smiles polite but distant, their movements almost robotic. The atmosphere was polished, smooth, and perfect. But beneath the surface, Hannah could sense something lurking, something waiting to reveal itself. And then she saw him, Pierre Dubois, the owner of Le Coeur de Minuit. He was seated at a table near the back, surrounded by a group of well-dressed individuals who seemed out of place. They were talking in low, hushed voices, their faces obscured by shadows. Hannah had done her research on Dubois. He was an enigmatic figure, wealthy, elusive, with no known ties to any criminal activity, but there was something about him that felt wrong, something that didn't add up. As she watched from her perch at the bar, the group at the back table stood and left the restaurant. The last to leave was Pierre Dubois, who shot Hannah a knowing glance as he passed her. She stiffened, unnerved by the coldness in his gaze, but she steeled herself. This was her chance. She had to follow him. Hannah slipped out of her seat and followed Du Bois through the back exit. She kept a safe distance, her heart pounding in her chest as she trailed him down darkened alleyways. He moved with purpose, like someone who knew exactly where they were going, and before long, he led her to a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. It was hidden in plain sight, a place that could easily have been overlooked, a warehouse of sorts, industrial and cold. She watched from the shadows as Du Bois entered the building, disappearing into the darkness. The door creaked closed behind him, and for a moment, Hannah stood frozen in the night air. She had uncovered something she hadn't expected, a secret hidden right under the nose of the public. She couldn't turn back now. With cautious steps, she approached the building and found a small side entrance. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear muffled voices inside. She pushed it open slowly, entering a vast, dimly lit hall. It smelled of old wood and incense, a thick, musky aroma that filled her lungs. The room was lined with tall, wooden shelves, each one holding strange, unfamiliar objects: candles, skulls, ornate knives, and other ritualistic items she didn't understand. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what this place was. A ritual chamber. At the far end of the room, Pierre Du Bois stood before a long wooden table, flanked by a group of individuals dressed in dark robes. They were chanting in a language she didn't recognize, their voices rising in a rhythmic pattern, almost hypnotic. On the table before them lay a dish, intricately arranged, covered by a cloth. Hannah's stomach churned as she crept closer, her eyes darting between the figures. As the chanting grew louder, Pierre lifted the cloth from the table, revealing a bloody sacrifice, a human heart, still fresh and beating. Her pulse quickened as she realized the truth. The disappearances, the strange atmosphere, it looked her diminuate, the unexplainable vanishings. It was all connected to these rituals. Pierre Du Bois and his secret society were sacrificing people during special dinners, using them as part of a dark, ancient ceremony. Before she could retreat, a hand gripped her shoulder. She spun around to face one of the robed figures, whose face was hidden in shadow. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized too late that she had been spotted. "No one leaves," the figure hissed, pulling her deeper into the chamber. "You're part of the ritual now." Panic surged through Hannah, but before she could scream, everything went dark. The last thing she remembered was the coldness of the figure's grip, the chant ringing in her ears, and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her chest. The next morning, the police were called to look her diminuate. Another customer had vanished without a trace. But this time, the investigation wasn't as simple as the others. A journalist had gone missing, and the case was quickly linked to the mysterious disappearances that had plagued the city. But when the authorities arrived at the warehouse, it was empty. No sign of a struggle, no evidence of any crime. The ritual chamber had vanished, as though it had never existed. Hannah Clark was never found. Her disappearance, like those before her, became part of the growing list of unexplained cases that haunted St. Mark's. And look, her diminuate remained open, its doors welcoming a new wave of customers every night. But no one would ever truly know what happened inside those walls. What dark forces controlled the fate of those who dined there? Story 4. The light that never should have been. The town of Evershade was small, quiet, and picturesque, a place where life moved at a steady, unhurried pace. Families lived in cozy homes with white picket fences, and the streets were lined with trees that painted the town in a lush, green hue each spring. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the simple comforts of small-town life made the world feel safe. But on the outskirts of Evershade, hidden behind a veil of creeping vines and weathered bricks, stood a restaurant that the townspeople whispered about in hushed tones. The restaurant, called the Beacon's Light, had a reputation for offering the most exquisite meals, its menu filled with a diverse range of dishes that seemed to transport diners to distant lands. Its owner, an older man named Samuel Drayton, was a reserved figure, always polite but distant, with eyes that seemed to hold a secret. He had come to Evershade years ago, opening the restaurant to little fanfare, but over time, it grew into a local favorite. There was something oddly magnetic about the place, an allure that no one could quite explain. But every evening, families gathered at its candlelit tables, drawn in by its charm. On one such evening, the Lambert family, Father Tom, Mother Alice, and their two children, Emily and Jacob, decided to dine at the Beacon's Light. They had heard much about the restaurant's mysterious atmosphere and were eager to experience it for themselves. The interior was just as enchanting as they had imagined. Dimly lit, with vintage chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, casting flickering shadows over the long oak tables. The walls were adorned with paintings of far-off places, each one seemingly pulled from the pages of a storybook. After a delicious meal and some lively conversation, the family settled in for dessert. As the evening wore on, Tom noticed something strange. The lights in the restaurant flickered briefly, casting the room in brief, unsettling darkness before returning to their normal brightness. He brushed it off as nothing more than an electrical issue, but it was not the last time he would notice the strange flickering. The next night, the Lambert family returned for another dinner, eager to enjoy the cozy atmosphere once more. But this time, something was different. As the evening wound down, and the last few customers left the restaurant, Alice mentioned to Tom that she had noticed the lights flickering once again. This time, however, she heard faint sounds from the basement, a low hum, almost like machinery at work. The restaurant was supposed to be closed, but the sounds seemed to suggest otherwise. Later that evening, after the family had retired to their room at the Small and they were staying at above the restaurant, Emily, the youngest child, couldn't shake her curiosity. She had always been the adventurous type, and the mystery of the strange lights and noises had been eating away at her. She decided to sneak down to the basement to uncover the source of the odd sounds. Her heart raced as she descended the narrow staircase, each creak of the old wood echoing in the silence of the night. The basement was cold and damp, its stone walls covered in moss and cobwebs. But in the far corner of the room, Emily spotted a dim, pulsing light that seemed to emanate from behind a large wooden door. She approached it cautiously, the hum of machinery growing louder the closer she got. She pushed open the door, and her eyes widened in disbelief. What she saw inside the room was like something out of a nightmare. The room was filled with strange machines, cogs and levers, wires and pipes, twisting and turning, their movements perfectly synchronized. But it wasn't the machinery itself that caught Emily's attention. It was the large, glowing contraption at the center of the room, an apparatus that seemed to be connected to a strange, pulsating light. The light flickered erratically, as if it were alive, casting shadows across the room. And in the center of it all was a large, circular mirror covered in what appeared to be intricate symbols. As Emily stepped closer to the machine, she felt an eerie chill pass over her skin. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the mirror, and the light flickered violently. For a brief moment, the reflection in the mirror seemed to change, distorting, warping, until it no longer reflected the basement, but something else entirely. In the mirror, she saw an image of the restaurant as it had looked many years ago, its walls pristine, the tables full of life. But there, sitting at one of the tables, was a woman, beautiful, with long, dark hair, her face hauntingly familiar. Emily recoiled in shock. The woman in the mirror looked like Alice, her mother. But this wasn't possible. It didn't make sense. Suddenly, Emily was jolted out of her trance by a loud voice from behind her. "What are you doing down here?" Startled, she spun around to find Samuel Drayton standing at the door, his face stern, his expression dark. He seemed to know exactly what she had discovered. "You shouldn't have seen this," he said quietly, stepping into the room. "It was never meant for anyone to know." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "What is this? What are you doing?" Drayton hesitated, his eyes flickering to the strange machine. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been trying to bring her back. My wife, Evelyn. She died years ago, and I've been working on this machine to bring her back from the dead." Emily's mind raced. "This machine, the lights, it's all connected to that." "Yes," Drayton replied softly. "The lights are the result of the breach. A tear between the world of the living and the dead. I've been using the restaurant as a vessel, a place where I can channel the energy needed to open the rift and bring her back. He stepped closer to the glowing machine, his face a mask of determination. But it's not just about bringing her back. It's about bringing everything back. The light, the rift, the portal. It can do more than just revive the dead. It can open the door to another world entirely. Emily's breath caught in her throat. A portal? A portal to what? Drayton looked at her with a somber expression. To a place where time and reality do not exist. A place where the living and the dead can coexist. But the cost, he trailed off, his eyes haunted. The cost is too great. You see, the portal is unstable. And every time I use the machine, the rift grows larger. Soon, it will be impossible to close. Just as the words left his lips, the light in the room flickered wildly, and Emily felt the temperature drop. The mirror began to warp again, this time revealing something far more terrifying. Shadows began to shift within the mirror, forming into shapes, human-like figures with glowing eyes, reaching out as if trying to escape. The room seemed to tremble as the machinery hummed louder, its power growing out of control. "No!" Drayton shouted, rushing toward the machine, but it was too late. The rift had opened, and as the light reached a blinding intensity, the room was swallowed by darkness. When the Lambert family awoke the next morning, the beacon's light was gone. The restaurant, the basement, the machine, all of it had vanished as though they had never existed. In its place stood an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, the remnants of an old building long forgotten. But in Emily's mind, the image of the mirror lingered. The woman who had looked like her mother, the distorted figures reaching through the portal. And as they left Evershade, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, hidden between the worlds, the light still flickered, waiting to open again. The question lingered, unanswered. Had they opened a door to another world? And if so, what had come through? Story 5. The Painting That Watches You. Nestled on a quiet corner in the heart of town was Le Petit Bistro, a charming eatery known not only for its exquisite cuisine, but also for its eclectic collection of art. The bistro's walls were adorned with paintings ranging from abstract masterpieces to classical portraits, each carefully chosen to create an atmosphere of sophistication and intrigue. But among all these works of art, there was one that seemed to hold an unsettling presence, a portrait that stood out for all the wrong reasons. The painting, hung in the dining area near the back wall, depicted a family dressed in formal attire, posing as if captured in an intimate moment. It was an elegant scene with a man, a woman, and their 2 children seated in a grandiose parlor. At first glance, it seemed like any other old family portrait, but there was something deeply wrong about it. The eyes of the figures in the painting, especially the eyes of the father, seemed to follow diners as they moved about the room, their gaze piercing and intense. No matter where one sat, the eyes remained fixed, tracking each movement, watching with an unnerving attentiveness. For years, the bistro's patrons had whispered about the painting, each person who sat near it feeling an inexplicable unease. Some claimed to feel a chill when they passed it. Others swore they saw the family's eyes flicker or shift in the dim light. The staff, though used to the strange atmosphere, did little to address the rumors. They had all heard the stories, the ones that spoke of the painting's curse, though no one ever dared to ask too much. One evening, a man named Victor Barlow, an ambitious and skeptical art critic, decided to dine at Le Petit Bistro. He had heard the rumors about the painting and thought it nothing more than local superstition. After all, it was just a portrait, and such things couldn't possibly hold power. He was eager to write a review of the restaurant for a prestigious publication, and what better way to cement his reputation than by debunking a well-known myth? Victor chose a table directly beneath the portrait, placing his order with a casual, dismissive air. As the evening progressed, he found himself increasingly aware of the eyes in the painting. At first, he brushed it off as a trick of the light, but no matter where he shifted in his chair, the eyes followed him. He could feel them on the back of his neck, burning into him with a strange, oppressive intensity. It made him uneasy, but he told himself it was just the power of suggestion. Curiosity soon overcame skepticism. Victor reached out and lightly tapped the frame of the painting, a gesture that would prove to be his undoing. It was as if the touch had unlocked something hidden within the very fibers of the canvas. Immediately, his surroundings seemed to shift. The sounds of the bistro, the clinking of silverware, the hum of conversation, faded into an eerie silence. He felt a sharp, unnatural cold creeping across his skin. And then the world around him blurred. Victor blinked rapidly as he found himself transported to an entirely different place. He was no longer in the bistro, but in a grand, darkened parlor, identical to the one in the painting, only it felt colder, more suffocating. The family from the portrait was there, but they were not posed in elegant stillness. They were moving, their faces twisted in expressions of grief, rage, and despair. The man, the father from the painting, stood at the center of the room, his face contorted in fury. His wife stood beside him, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with fear. The two children, once innocent in their portrait, now stared with hollow eyes, their faces pale and lifeless. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, oppressive, as though the very air was thick with the weight of something unspeakable. Victor stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He was trapped in the painting. The family's eyes locked onto him, and in that moment, he understood. Their tragic fate was not just part of some distant history. It was alive. It was real. The father's voice echoed in the stillness, deep and guttural. "You've disturbed us. Now, you will see what we saw." Suddenly, a vision erupted in Victor's mind. A vivid, horrifying image of the family's last night. It played out like a nightmare, with the father desperate and broken, lashing out in a fit of rage. He had murdered his wife in a brutal frenzy, the room filled with the sounds of screaming and blood. The children had witnessed it all, helpless and terrified. The father's guilt and madness grew, his mind unraveling until, in the end, he turned the weapon on himself, ending his own life in the same room where the portrait had been painted. Victor gasped, stumbling back as the vision consumed him. He felt the crushing weight of the family's anguish, their sorrow and rage filling his chest like a heavy stone. His stomach churned, and for a moment, he thought he might be sick. The pain, the horror, was so real, so visceral, that it felt as if he had lived it himself. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, but Victor was not left unscathed. He stood in the parlor, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. The family's eyes were still locked on him, their expressions twisted in eternal suffering. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something more, an empty chair sitting at the table in the center of the room. A chair that seemed to beckon him, urging him to sit. Desperate to escape, Victor turned and fled the parlor, stumbling back into the bistro. But as he rushed past the table, he saw it. The same family, still watching him from the portrait. Their eyes, once again, followed his every movement. He had disturbed something ancient, something bound to the painting, and now he was cursed. Over the next few days, Victor's mind unraveled. He could no longer tell where reality ended and the visions began. Everywhere he went, he saw the faces of the family, on the street, in windows, even in the reflection of glass. Their eyes never left him. The curse had taken hold. As time passed, Victor became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the family was watching his every move, waiting for him to pay for his disrespect. He tried to leave town to escape the painting's power, but wherever he went, he saw the same haunting faces. No matter how far he traveled, the eyes followed him, their gaze never faltering. Victor's fate was sealed. The curse of the painting had passed down through generations. Each person who dared to challenge it forced to relive the family's tragic history. And now it was his turn. The once confident critic had become nothing more than a shattered man, tormented by the past he had unwittingly unleashed. One final vision took hold of him. In it, he was seated at the table in the parlor, the very same chair that had beckoned him all those nights ago. The family surrounded him, their eyes glowing with malevolent satisfaction. He had joined them. He was part of their curse now, condemned to live out the tragedy over and over again. as it had been for so many before him. And so, Victor Barlow became yet another name on the list of those who had dared to challenge the painting's power. The bistro continued to thrive, its walls still adorned with art, its patrons unaware of the dark force that lingered just beyond the canvas. But for those who had ever sat near the portrait, the chilling truth remained. The painting watched, and it never forgot. The twist connecting the stories. As the evening wore on, the group of strangers at the small, dimly lit restaurant continued to share their eerie tales. The atmosphere had grown heavy with the weight of the stories, and an unease seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud. Each of them had recounted their experiences at different haunted restaurants, some of which they had visited years ago, others just recently. The stories were horrifying, chilling, and steeped in the supernatural, each one more disturbing than the last. The couple who had visited the haunted diner were the first to speak, recounting the chilling experience of being trapped in the world of restless spirits, where they had relived the tragic fate of the diner's original owners. They spoke of the eerie atmosphere that seemed to permeate the very walls, the flickering lights, and the feeling that something, or someone, was always watching them. The journalist, who had investigated the strange disappearances at Vanishing customers, a restaurant mystery, shared her own terrifying tale. She spoke of her growing suspicions about the restaurant's owner and the ties to a secret society, only to become a target herself. Her story sent a shiver through the group, the idea of an unseen force pulling the strings behind the scenes, unsettling them all. The man who had dared to challenge the cursed painting at the Painting That Watches You spoke next. He told them of his own unraveling sanity, driven by the eyes that followed him everywhere. He recounted the horrifying vision of the family's betrayal, murder, and the generational curse that he had been condemned to live through. And finally, the family who had stumbled upon the strange machine in the basement of the light that never should have been told their tale. They spoke of their innocent discovery, of a light that seemed to stretch time and space, and how the owner's twisted desire to bring someone back from the dead had opened a portal between the living and the dead. They spoke of the terrifying moments when reality itself seemed to bend and twist, leaving them to question whether they had crossed into another world entirely. The stories were horrifying on their own, but as the group continued to exchange details, something strange began to emerge. There were connections between them, subtle threads weaving the stories together. The cursed objects, the painting, the light, the secret ingredients in the dishes were not isolated incidents. Each of them had been drawn to a place of darkness, a place with a sinister history, a place where the veil between the living and the dead had been torn. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. These places were all connected by an ancient curse that had been passed down through the generations, a curse that plagued restaurants known for their disturbing history. The group fell into a stunned silence as the realization took hold. The curse was real, and it wasn't just a coincidence that they had all been drawn to these places. There was a dark force at work, something ancient and malevolent, and they had all become part of its story. But there was still one mystery left to uncover: the final revelation. As the tension in the room grew, the strangers turned to each other, their faces pale and drawn. They had shared their darkest experiences, and now they were left to confront the chilling truth of their connection. But it was then that an unexpected voice broke the silence, a soft, raspy voice that seemed to come from the far corner of the room. The group turned toward the source of the voice, their hearts racing with unease. In the shadowed corner sat an old woman, hunched over, her eyes glistening with a knowing intensity. She had been sitting quietly throughout the entire conversation, her frail hands folded in her lap, her face mostly hidden beneath a veil of graying hair. No one had paid much attention to her at first, assuming she was just another elderly patron of the restaurant. But now, as her voice broke through the tension, the group saw her for what she truly was, a woman who had been listening, observing, perhaps even waiting. "You all think you've uncovered the truth," the woman said, her voice like a whisper carried by the wind. "But you've only just begun to scratch the surface. The stories you've shared are not just tales of misfortune. They are warnings. Warnings about a curse far older than you can imagine." The The group exchanged uneasy glances. "What do you mean?" the journalist asked, her voice trembling. "What curse? We thought we were the only ones." The woman chuckled softly, a sound that sent chills down their spines. She lifted her hand, motioning for them to gather closer. "Oh, my dear, you have no idea how many have fallen victim to this curse. It spans centuries, woven through the fabric of the very places you visited. You see, these restaurants, they are no ordinary establishments. They are vessels for a dark power that feeds on the souls of the unwary." The group leaned in, their eyes fixed on her. They had to know more. "I should know," the woman continued, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of sorrow and something darker. "I am the original owner of one of those cursed restaurants. The Haunted Diner, to be precise. That place, it was never just a diner. It was a trap, a place where those who dared to enter became bound to the curse that had been set in motion long before my time." The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with tension as the woman's words sank in. She revealed that her family had been the original proprietors of the Haunted Diner, and that it had been built upon a site known for its dark history, an ancient burial ground forgotten by time. The diner had been a place of solace for many, but beneath the surface, it had been designed to draw in the unsuspecting, to feed off their energy, to trap their souls in an endless loop of torment. But it was not just the Haunted Diner, the woman continued. Each of these restaurants, these cursed places you visited, they were all linked by that same dark force. The light that never should have been, the painting that watches you, the curse of the forbidden dish. All of them were built to feed that force, to keep the curse alive. And now, because of your actions, it has gained strength. The group recoiled in horror as the realization hit them all at once. They were not just victims of the curse. They were its new bearers, chosen to continue its cycle. "You thought you had escaped," the woman whispered. "But the curse has followed you. It is inside you now, and it will never let you go. You will see the same visions, hear the same whispers, and feel the same pull that I did, and you will pass it on to the next." A heavy silence fell over the room as the gravity of her words sank in. The woman's face twisted with a mix of regret and grim resignation. "Your stories, they're not over," she warned. "They've only just begun." As the group sat frozen in shock, the bistro's lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. In the flickering glow, the figures in the portraits around them seemed to shift, their eyes following each of them with renewed intensity. The curse had found them all, and now there was no escape. The old woman's voice echoed one last time, a haunting whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The curse is eternal, and it will never be lifted." The restaurant was silent now, a heavy, oppressive stillness in the air. The flickering lights that had once seemed benign now felt like ominous signals of an impending doom. The group of strangers, once full of nervous curiosity and eager to share their terrifying experiences, now sat motionless, their eyes wide with horror and disbelief. The woman's chilling revelation echoed in their minds, each word a hammering reminder of the inescapable truth they had been forced to confront. They were all linked. They were all bound to the same curse, drawn together by the very forces they had thought they had escaped. The initial shock of the old woman's words had numbed them, but now, as the reality set in, the weight of the curse settled on their shoulders. They had thought they were sharing stories of isolated horrors, disconnected events that could be explained away by coincidence or superstition. But now it was clear. The stories had been woven together by an ancient force, a malevolent power that had followed them from one haunted restaurant to another, feeding off their fear, their ambition, and their greed. Some of them began to tremble, unable to shake the thought that their fate had already been sealed. The journalist, who had uncovered the dark truth behind the vanishing customer's mystery, stared blankly ahead, her mind racing. She had already become a target once, but now, knowing the full extent of the curse, she feared what would come next. The man who had challenged the painting's power clutched his head in his hands, as if trying to block out the horrifying images that still haunted him. The couple from the haunted diner sat frozen, their bodies stiff with fear, as they slowly realized that they too had been drawn into this web of terror. As the silence stretched, the old woman's voice broke through once again. "You are not alone in this," she said, her voice steady yet tinged with sorrow. "The curse has many faces, many victims. It has followed you all this time, silently watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. You thought your experiences were isolated, but the truth is far more terrifying." The group absorbed her words, each person grappling with the realization that they had been part of something far greater than any of them could have imagined. The curse had never been about one person or one event. It was about a cycle, a never-ending cycle of greed, ambition, and vengeance that had festered in the dark corners of the world, in places where people sought something more than just sustenance. They had walked into these restaurants thinking they were simply enjoying a meal or indulging in an experience. But they had unknowingly entered the domain of something far darker, something that had taken root in the very foundations of these establishments. The old woman continued, her gaze piercing through each of them. "The stories you've shared, they are not just tales of ghostly hauntings or cursed objects. They are warnings. Warnings about the dangers of seeking more than what is meant to be. The haunted diner, the light that never should have been, the painting that watches you. They were never just restaurants. They were vessels for something else, something that thrives on the darkness within us all." The journalist swallowed hard, her mind still reeling from the knowledge that the secret society she had uncovered was just a small part of something much larger. The man who had interacted with the painting trembled, the weight of the curse now pressing in on him like a physical force. And the couple, once so eager to share their ghostly encounter, now sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting nervously as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "This is a lesson," the woman whispered, her voice growing softer, more ominous. "The most disturbing things are never far from us. They hide in plain sight, behind the doors we think are safe, in the places we think are normal. Greed, vengeance, ambition, these things fester, and in the end, they lead to horrors we can't escape." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The group now saw the truth in the old woman's words. Each story, they had shared a piece of a much larger puzzle. The forbidden dish, the cursed painting, the mysterious disappearances. Each one was a manifestation of humanity's darkest impulses. They had walked into these haunted places, unknowingly feeding into the curse that had been set into motion centuries ago. The restaurants were never just places to eat. They were sanctuaries for darkness. And as each visitor unknowingly contributed to the curse, it had only grown stronger, feeding off their fears and desires. The greed of the restaurant owners, the ambition of the critics, the vengeance of the spirits, they had all converged in these places, creating a perfect storm of terror that would not stop until it had consumed them all. The old woman's voice dropped to a whisper. "The world is full of places like these, hidden in plain sight. And you, my dear strangers, have all unknowingly entered into one of them. The curse is older than you can imagine, and it has found you all." The room seemed to close in on them, the flickering lights casting strange shadows against the walls, as if the restaurant itself were alive, feeding on their terror. The once familiar space now felt alien, a place where time and space had lost all meaning. The paintings on the walls no longer seemed like mere decorations. They were eyes, watching them, waiting for them to make a move. The air grew thick with tension, and the group realized with dawning horror that the curse had followed them here, into this very room. After what felt like hours, the strangers began to stir. One by one, they rose from their seats, as if compelled by an invisible force. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the lights above, their flickering now more pronounced, more erratic. It was as though the very restaurant was holding its breath, waiting for something. The group slowly made their way toward the exit, but as they approached the door, a sudden chill ran down their spines. They had been so focused on the stories on the curse that they hadn't noticed how the air had changed, how the world outside had shifted. The door creaked open, but the streets outside were empty, eerily so. The usual bustle of the city had faded into an unsettling stillness, as if the world had stopped moving. The group hesitated at the threshold, their hearts pounding in their chests. Had they really escaped? Or was this just another illusion? They looked at one another, the weight of their shared experiences pressing down on them like a suffocating fog. The curse had followed them, but they didn't know where it would take them next. Would they truly escape it? Or had they simply moved on to the next chapter of a never-ending cycle? As they stepped out into the night, the air felt colder than it should. The lights flickered again behind them, casting long shadows on the walls of the restaurant. It was as if the building itself was watching them leave, waiting for them to return. The final question echoed in their minds, unanswered and haunting. Had the horror ended, or was it only just beginning?